Right, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that this gathering is taking place on Mississauga and Anishinaabe territory that has been the home and hunting grounds to many people, including the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and the Mississauga of the New Credit. It is this territory of the One Dish, One Spoon Treaty, which was made between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee in order to share hunting and fishing territories. We affirm our solidarity with the indigenous people of this land struggling for their self-determination from settler colonialism here, and are eager to be convening to discuss resistance to settler colonialism in Palestine today. We now turn to Noura Erakat to hear about her insights on resistance on the ground in Palestine. It is such an honor to introduce Noura Erakat, who is a human rights attorney and activist. As of fall 2014, she is an assistant professor at George Mason University. She has taught international human rights law in the Middle East at Georgetown University since spring 2009. Noura is also a co-editor of Jadaliyya. Most recently, she served as legal counsel for the Domestic Policy Subcommittee of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee in the House of Representatives. Prior to her time on Capitol Hill, Noura received a New Voices Fellowship to work as the national grassroots organizer and legal advocate at the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation, where she helped see BDS campaigns nationally, as well as support the cases brought against two former Israeli officials in US federal courts for alleged war crimes. For several years, Noura worked as the Legal Advocacy Coordinator for the Badil Center for Refugee and Residency Rights. In that capacity, she drafted their submissions to the human rights treaty bodies and lobbied the US Congress, as well as diplomatic missions at the United Nations on their behalf. Prior to attending law school, she helped launch the divestment campaign along with the Students for Justice in Palestine at UC Berkeley in 2001. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Noura Erakat.
Thank you all. I again want to reiterate that I do wish that I was there. I think Toronto functions much like the Bay Area where I grew up, in that it seems to be ahead of the curve, and what you do tends to be exported elsewhere, from your film festivals to Israeli Apartheid Week, first divestment amongst a labor union, and the list can go on. So I'm not surprised that you are facing such criminalization, surveillance, and pushback from your administration and others, because once the cat is out of your box, it's a little hard to contain. So thank you for your leadership in that. Let me start by saying that I spent the month of December in the West Bank, and so I don't, and I try to travel Jerusalem, which is part of the West Bank, but you'd never know it because of the intense fragmentation and the checkpoints that are erected in order to make an impermeable border, even for the surrounding areas of Jerusalem, which I'll be discussing in greater detail and is a focal point of what's going on the ground. I also made it to Tel Aviv and Jaffa, and wasn't able to go to do much more than that. And the reason for that, aside from the personal reasons, is again, the way that Israel polices Palestinian movement is so severe that if I were to travel into any of these ports, I travel not as a Palestinian identity card holder, because that was revoked from my father without due process, secretly, and so I don't have a Palestinian ID either. Significantly, the revocation of his ID card was part of an entire wave of revocations between '67 and 2004, known as silent deportations. And the Palestinian Palestinian Center Bureau of Statistics, estimates that but for these revocations, the Palestinian population of the West Bank would be greater by 14%, demonstrating that the demographic logic that guides Israel vis-a-vis Palestinian citizens of Israel, refugees in exile, also guides their policies towards Palestinians in the occupied territories as well. None of mandatory Palestine is immune from Israel's settler colonial ambitions. And so to travel I travel with a passport. To travel beyond, the narrow confines of the West Bank is really hard. Even travel within the West Bank is incredibly hard. You see surrounding all Palestinian areas are built up military infrastructure, built up settlement infrastructure, built up what will be military infrastructure that will become settlement infrastructure. And the purpose of it is twofold. One is to be able to expropriate that land for exclusive Jewish enjoyment, or I should say Jewish-Israeli enjoyment. And the other part of it, and that happens, and I can talk about that in detail, so excuse my shorthand, but that happens in collaboration with the KKL, also known as the Jewish National Fund, which has a seat on the Israeli Land Authority. And so there's an entire way in which the expropriation becomes state property and then becomes available for the exclusive enjoyment of Jewish Israelis. So the shorthand is not meant to avoid the detail, but I'm assuming knowledge on your part and happy to answer questions later. The point is that the land is confiscated in order to bring it into state land ownership. And more importantly, the reason for this built up infrastructure is to separate Palestinians from one another. And this is something that's very age old and is very obvious throughout, whether it be in the West Bank. And so can we go to the slide 4 and 5? Yeah. Okay, so slide 4, and if you go to slide 5, it's a bit more obvious. If you can show me the screen, that would be helpful. I'll look at it with you. So you can see in slide 4 and 5 the way that, what we refer to very casually as the Bantu-Tustanization of the West Bank. It shouldn't be as casual as we make it, because this is actually the fragmentation of society, and the purpose is to hinder the Palestinian national cohesion and to hinder the formation of a Palestinian nationalism. And it's not just evident within the West Bank, but if you go to slide 6, the next slide, and I'll get to these slides on another issue I was going to discuss. If you go here to slide 6, this is the south of Israel. This is the Negev Desert. And you can see that the removal and concentration of Palestinians is not only evident in the West Bank, but also evident within Israel itself. What you don't see on this map is that in the north of mandatory Palestine, or in the north of Israel proper, is also the other concentration of Palestinians. 71% of Palestinian citizens of Israel live in the Galilee area. So, and they live away from one another. And if you go to slide 7, you could see this happen in the Gaza Strip, of course, most dramatically, most vividly, most violently, most brutally. You could see the concentration and isolation of Palestinians there. That concentration is one of the 3 elements of the settler colonial process that dominates Israel's its project. The first is dispossession, to dispossess Palestinians of their lands. The second is removal, to remove them altogether, either by secret deportations like my father, the denial of entry like our friends who have been denied entry, or forced exile of approximately 7 million Palestinian refugees, the continuing removal within Israel, for example, on the ban on family reunification that denies Palestinian citizens of Israel to acquire citizenship for their spouses if they happen to come from enemy areas that are not coincidentally the same areas where there are majority Palestinians in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, in Syria, and in Lebanon. And this removal also takes place in the form of death, as we see in the all-out warfare on the Gaza Strip, and now in the increasing military violence against Palestinians throughout the West Bank, including Jerusalem, but most prominently in Jerusalem. So dispossession, removal, and concentration. And concentration is key. The concentration is necessary because it puts the greatest amount of Palestinians on the least amount of land. And it confiscates the greatest amount of Palestinian lands with the least number of Palestinians. And that is absolutely key. And it happens throughout the area. So it fulfills both the desire to acquire that land without Palestinian presence in order to replace their presence with Jewish Israelis, but it it also happens in order to fragment the Palestinian population and in order to undermine a national cohesion. So that Palestinians in Jerusalem are very separate from Palestinians in Ramallah because of the way that administrative law works to police their movement. That Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank is quite obvious, but even the way that Palestinians in Haifa are removed from Palestinians in Bethlehem. And so this is by no means any form of coincidence. So I didn't mean to start there, but I wanted to start with my trip at home in Palestine because I'm to share an observation that I made, which is, today we celebrate a major victory that the United Methodist Church divested its holdings from Israeli banks that profit from and finance the settlements. And this is key as a duty. Not only because it represents, right, the achievements amongst the faith-based community, and the mainstreaming of BDS is a very reasonable. It's not radical. BDS is not radical, okay? And amongst a lot of Palestinian circles, the complaint is that it's not radical. It's not a radical strategy. It's a very moderate one, and that's becoming more plainly obvious to everyone, as evidenced by these mounting successes. And it's important that we note that the banks are the ones that were targeted because these are Israeli banks that are inextricably linked to the settlement enterprise that works to undermine the imaginary partition liberal Zionists try to create between Israel and the occupied territory, when in fact they're inextricably linked in terms of infrastructure, law, highways, policing, and so on, economically, obviously, trade, education-wise, that there are inextricable links that make it impossible to declare that there is in fact a partition and the apartheid wall, or the annexation wall, that make it impossible to acknowledge that there is in fact a partition that we can take seriously. There's a singular Israeli regime, and it manifests itself throughout the territory without interruption. So notwithstanding these mounting victories, today's victory included, on the ground, none of those victories are manifesting. With the exception of a few things like the SodaStream moving from the West Bank into Israel proper, plus the fact that Veolia, the French train company, is no longer maintaining its contract in order to connect these settlements to one another and to connect Tel Aviv to Jerusalem uninterrupted so that the train line goes through Israeli built-up areas so that you never have to see a Palestinian. So with the exception of those victories and maybe a handful of other BDS victories, none of these mounting successes that we're waging and we're experiencing in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, in South America, in the Arab world as well, are being felt on the ground. The conditions are miserable. They're worse than they've ever been, and unfortunately every year it's successively worse than it's ever been. What remains is a steadfastness and sumud, and it takes an incredible amount of energy to remain steadfast in the face of such conditions. So that a friend of mine who's a Jerusalemite went to a protest in Jerusalem to protest the deportation of a Jerusalemite, because this is the strategy. In order to consolidate Israel's hegemony over Jerusalem, there are a number of tactics used. The Center of Life policy, where Palestinian Jerusalemites have to establish their residency for 7 consecutive years. That means that Palestinian students in Jerusalem who study abroad lose their residency. I saw Dr. Hanan Ashrawi during this visit. I'm doing research. I was interviewing her. Her daughters both had the Jerusalemite residency revoked. So here you have a member of the executive committee of the PLO who can do nothing. She's powerless to get that residency back for her own daughters. Retroactive taxes. So this is a tactic where the municipal administration applies taxes that it wants to apply retroactively, that it decides were triggered 7 years ago, and so they apply the taxes as if they've accrued for 7 years, even though there was never notice that that tax existed. So imagine a family who's barely subsisting getting a bill for something like 15,000 shekels, which amounts to something 4,000 plus dollars. Or no, a little less, excuse me, $3,000 plus, who don't have that, who can't pay those taxes. They're forced to leave. Other tactics include outright confiscation, settler takeovers, deportations, detention. A friend of mine, Daoud Ghul, I could not see him on this trip. He's a young youth organizer from Silwan because he is incarcerated. What is the charge against him? He was organizing youth activities in Silwan, where Israel had more in that area. He was accused of incitement. And so we should take very seriously what Israel means by incitement. Another person that I see almost on every trip I make is Rifqa al-Qurd, a 90-year-old woman, a refugee who in 1948 was removed from her home in Ramleh, was placed in Sheikh Jarrah. In Sheikh Jarrah, the homes were built in I don't want to say the year because I don't want to be held accountable if I mess up. Let's just say they were built after her removal in 1948 in Sheikh Jarrah by Jordanian authorities. Israel has now marked Sheikh Jarrah along with Al-Isawiyya, Silwan, Al-Izariyya, Tur, and other Palestinian suburbs that surround Jerusalem that have not been excluded from the annexation wall as Israeli territory. They want the land without the Palestinians. How do they achieve that? Can we go to the video that was the link on slide 3? If this is the right video, I can't see it. This is Kurd. This was a settler takeover. Settlers have been financed by the Israeli government to go and sit in to squat Palestinian homes where the residents are still located. And so, and Palestinians are absolutely powerless to do anything to remove them. And the Israeli police, rather than protect the Palestinians who are protected persons under the law of occupation, and I'll get to that, actually protect the settlers who are doing this. So they're financed to be in those homes, and they're protected by the Israeli police. There is no separation from the West Bank and the rest of Israel's infrastructure. These are not military officers that protect these settlers. These are Israel's police, law enforcement. While you're showing that, I'll just continue to tell you a little bit about Jerusalem and why Jerusalem is so significant to my conversation today, because the recent, what Palestinians have been calling a hebbe. So hebbe is like something of a, not an uprising. Is there an Arabic speaker who can translate it better than me?
A flare-up.
Flare-up, yeah.
Flare-up. Okay, hebbe is, yes, that's a great way. A hebbe is a flare-up. Palestinians are referring to the recent actions right now in the West Bank as a flare-up. It's not a third intifada. It's far from. It's a flare-up. And the reason is because they started in Jerusalem, just like the 2000 second intifada started in Jerusalem, since October 1st, when Muhannad Halabi attacked and killed a settler and a soldier on the Al-Aqsa Sharif. Israeli forces have killed 142 Palestinians, injured 15,620 Palestinians, and killed, in those numbers, 27 children. Palestinians in turn have killed 24 Israelis during that same time, and yet we've seen nothing in the news about the context surrounding Jerusalem that explains a flare-up and a build-up of tensions for many decades, especially since the annexation of Jerusalem in 1980. Instead, what we hear is that Israelis are suffering from terrorist attacks in a way that basically elides the existence of Palestinians and their entire subjectivity and frankly, their eligibility to be victims. Is there no sound?
This time. Let me come in.
اطلع برا انت كمان اطلع برا اطلع برا اطلع برا برا اطلع انت كمان اطلع برا انت كمان اطلع برا يخرب بيتك حيوان
هو الدرس يا ولد هو الدرس هو الدوق
بلد ابوك اللي اطلع برا اطلع برا امشي امشي برا
بس توقع عليه
طولي بالك.
عايش والله
طولي بالك. طولي بالك.
شو طول بالي شو طول بالي احسبت
بس توقع بس توقع عليه
ما بتقول اطلع التربه يلا اطلع برا وانت وانت كمان
بس توقع يا ما
مسكها يخرب بيتك حيوان
So to translate the Arabic "itla barra," I can come back on screen.
Yeah.
Okay. To translate the Arabic "itla barra," all she was saying is leave, leave, leave. At one point she says "ya haywan," you animal, and her son, or her grandson, I should say, was telling her to calm down and to move back. That's the most he can do. Can you imagine the powerlessness of not being able to protect your own home? There's been 4 families that have been evicted from their homes in this manner in Sheikh Jarrah, and that's the tip of the iceberg. If you go to slide 2. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I want to just demonstrate to you that the takeover of Jerusalem has been steady and systematic since 1948, when Israel first expelled 80,000 Palestinians from West Jerusalem, reducing its Palestinian population by half, and establishing Jewish-Israeli hegemony. That confiscation continued in 1967, and in 1980, when Israel unilaterally annexed East Jerusalem. In 1991, Jerusalem was enclosed, and now it required a military permit to travel between the West Bank surrounding areas and Jerusalem. This is the slated capital of the Palestinian state. In 1995, the Israeli Minister of Interior announced the Center of Life policy that I described to you earlier, about 7 consecutive years. And the result of that 1995 policy is also devastating. 5,000 Jerusalemite residents were evicted in 2008 alone. And Israel is very clear about its demographic ambitions in Jerusalem. It said so clearly in its Jerusalem master plan of 2000 that projected figures show the demographic balance shifting from 70-30 to 60-40 by 2020. So Israel is doing everything in its power to maintaining the demographic balance at 70-30. So it's outright social engineering. In 2002, when the annexation wall begins to be built, it annexes 13% of the West Bank, most significantly around East Jerusalem, which the International Court of Justice finds as illegal, and which the Israeli High Court of Justice replied with a very bewildering High Court decision that said that Israel, in balancing military exigencies and the protected population under its occupation, has to take into account that settlers are part of the protected population, which turns all of humanitarian law on its head, and concluded that Israel has the right to build the wall wherever those settlers may be, irrespective of their legal status. Notably, Article 49, Subclause 6 of the same convention holds that the settlements, all of them, are illegal and amount to a grave breach or a war crime. From 2002 to the present, you see the steady and systematic removal taking place, the construction of the Eastern Ring Road, the parastatal settler takeovers, which you just saw with Rifqa al-Kurd, E1 development, as well as disproportionate enforcement of zoning and planning laws in order to ghettoize Palestinians further. 2015, we're seeing yet another escalation. So that this provocation against Palestinians is also going to lead to their removal. Okay, now what I wanted to show you also, if we can go to slide 4, is that Jerusalem is a microcosm of the removal, dispossession, and concentration of Palestinians. Here's the West Bank. Go to the next slide, also the West Bank. It takes place within Israel as well, in the Negev as well as in the Galilee, if you go to the next slide. And it's taking place in the Gaza Strip, where the border has been expanded by 44% as a result of the last war. So, all of this is to provide us with the context that we are not seeing when we're bearing witness to this tragic flare-up that affects everybody, Israeli Jews and Palestinians alike, and more severely so Palestinians, as we can see by the number, but also the structural violence that's meted against the communities. Every person that's killed, mind you, the people, and here I want to also share, because I've just come, my cousin was was somebody who was shot 4 times in the head at a checkpoint. He was accused of taking out a gun and pointing it at a soldier, but we'll never know, because my cousin didn't get a trial. He wasn't charged. There were no witnesses. It was an accusation that sufficed in order to render him eligible for murder that quickly. And in response, not only does he not get a trial, which amounts to an extrajudicial assassination, right? His mama, who just removed a brain tumor, can no longer travel. She lives in Abu Dis, which is a suburb of East Jerusalem as well, can no longer travel to East Jerusalem to continue her chemotherapy because her son's murder registered her as a security threat. His wife and 4 children live in a home that will be demolished in punishment, as a form of collective punishment, also a prohibition of Article 33 of the 4th Geneva Convention. This should concern all of us. If these are indeed all knife-wielding, gun-wielding Palestinians who are attacking, why are they not being arrested and subject to trial? That's going to be enough to kill somebody. Can you imagine? That's an extrajudicial assassination. I could be standing on a corner one day in Palestine, looking the wrong way, be shot, be told in headlines that I was wielding a knife. What is going to exonerate me in my murder, and then register me and my entire family as security threats to the state, as terrorist threats? We're punished for our own violence meted against us. This is what we should be asking ourselves. What is giving rise to these conditions? And you don't have to look very far. In September 25th, 2015, this Knesset passed a law that made it lawful for soldiers and police officers to use live fire against Palestinians in the occupied territory. For anybody who understands military occupation, that is illegal. You are to use force allowed for a law enforcement authority. Israel doesn't recognize the de jure application of the 4th Geneva Convention, fine, but it recognizes the Hague regulations as customary law. That means they apply with or without ratification of that treaty. Article 43 of those regulations obligate Israel as an occupying power to maintain public order and security in the West Bank. It is not to use military force. It is to use police force. Using live fire is military force. That is shooting to kill. And that has happened legally from the Knesset. That is not a bunch of extremists. That is the governing Israeli body. And Palestinians, for so much as organizing a demonstration, for so much as speaking against it, are going to be imprisoned and detained like the Wood. For so much as engaging in boycott, divestment, and sanctions are to be...
This is strike 3.
Wait, Wait, can they watch the video before they leave?
Oh, okay, let's watch the video before you leave. Let's watch the video before you leave, actually.
I want them to watch the video, I think it should be slides, go to slide 10 first. Okay? Go to slide 10 first. This, you should know her, for those who are calling us terrorists. This is Ayelet Shaked. She is not a random extremist. She is the justice minister in Israel. She is part of the executive cabinet, okay? During the war on Gaza, she advocated that Palestinian mamas, okay, mothers, I'm a mother, that Palestinian mamas should be killed so that we can't birth little snakes, okay? She's also now supporting a law that criminalizes Israeli human rights workers and accuses Israeli, and we'll watch that video after this one I want to show you, that accuses Israeli human rights workers as being foreign agents and plants because they believe in human rights. So for those who are shouting terrorists, you sound like this one. You sound like...
Would like to kindly watch the video that Noura would like for us to watch?
Well, I just want to give you context for this video. This is the Blackship family, where at the end of July 2015, Israeli settlers threw a Molotov cocktail into their home in the middle of the night. These three that you see didn't survive that attack. They are all dead. The only survivor is a 4-year-old boy who is an orphan now and doesn't have his brother. Those Israeli settlers are not unique. If we're going to throw around words like terrorism, I just hope that we throw them around universally for all the attacks on civilians and not military installations. So if we can just get through this. I'm sorry, Nada, I'm going to miss your talk. I wanted to point out that this settler violence is not unique. We may have heard about this, but it is not unique. It goes unpunished. Yesh Din, an Israeli human rights organization, documented that 94% of the state's investigations into such incidents result in no indictments. They say that, quote, this brand of violence is part of a sophisticated, wider strategy designed to assert territorial domination over West Bank Palestinians. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, because of this impunity, settler violence increased 144% between 2009 and 2011. So with that in mind, I want you to watch this next video, which was a wedding that took place on a settlement, an Israeli wedding, where these wedding goers are celebrating the arson murder of the Dawabshe family by carrying effigies. This is a story that ran on Channel 10 Israeli News.
Okay.
המקום הוא אולם חתונות בירושלים, האירוע חתונתם של בני זוג מוכרים מאוד בימין הקיצוני. עשרות חבריהם של החתן והכלה הם גם חברי העצורים הנחקרים בשב"כ בחשד למעורבות ברצח 3 בני משפחת דוואבשה. הם מניפים רובים, אקדחים וסכינים, אחד מהם אף רוקד כשבקבוק תבערה בידו, כאות ניצחון לפיגוע הצתה שבוצע באמצעות השלכת 2 בקבוקי תבערה. החתונה מתקיימת שעה קלה אחרי שעורכי הדין של החשודים
Okay, I'll stop there and just say that that incident has been roundly condemned by Israeli government, but they speak out of 2 sides of their mouth. They condemn this and at the same time continue to treat settlers with impunity while funding them to continuously take over homes. I wanna end with one more video, and I'm glad you're bearing with me. I can talk endlessly analytically about the situation, but there's if you see it for yourself, it makes a difference. If the last video, even the Israeli left that is trying to work against the occupation, because this is not about Palestinians versus Israeli. This is about the end of settler colonialism. We're all on the side of justice. We're all on the side of human rights, Israeli human rights workers supporting the bill that Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked has introduced.
לפני שהמחבל הבא דוקר אותך, הוא כבר יודע שאיש המנוחים, שתול של הולנד, ידאג להגן עליו מפני חקירה של השב"כ. המחבל גם יודע שאבנר גבריהו, שתול של גרמניה, יקרא לחייל שינסה לסכל את הפיגוע פושע מלחמה. הוא גם יודע שסיגי בן ארי, שתולה של ממשלת נורווגיה, תגן עליו בבית המשפט. לפני שהמחבל הבא דוקר אותך, הוא כבר יודע שחגי אלעד, שתול של האיחוד האירופי, יקרא לישראל פושעת מלחמה. חגי, ישי, אבנר וסיגי הם ישראלים. הם גרים כאן איתנו והם שתולים. כשאנחנו נלחמים בטרור, הם נלחמים בנו. חוק השתולים יכול להוציא אותנו מחוץ לחוק. חיתנו עליו.
Okay, so that video is a very recent video, and it criminalizes even the Israelis that are working in the name of human rights, so that these attacks on Palestinians are not just against Palestinians, but anybody who's even using the language of human rights. Speaking about this makes people angry, as you can see, and yet we cannot stop speaking. We have to work even harder. We have to work far more devastating than we can imagine. And what we're doing here, this progress, the speed of our progress, globally, is far ahead of any kind of positive change on the ground. So we also have to think creatively. How do we leverage this popular support embodied by BDS victories into policy change? And that's what we should be thinking about next. Because the truth of the matter is that this process of removal, dispossession, and concentration continues, but it's a self-destructive process. It's not tenable. Israelis know this. They know that it's not tenable and are just short. They've already recommended for the annexation of all of Area C, and some in the Knesset are even okay with calling it outright apartheid and don't have a problem with that language either. And so here's a situation that can't last. What will happen when they call it apartheid? And the government keeps moving rightward. Netanyahu is a centrist in this government. What will happen when Israeli leaders call it apartheid and say, we're okay with that? What then will you do? And so now we're working in order to stop the inevitable and to now backtrack, move to a situation where there is a tenable and a viable peace, and that begins with ending these racist ethos that some people are worth more than others and have the right to live more than others. And that begins with a settler decolonization process, and I applaud you, Toronto, for bringing that awareness home, because we are also settlers, and the fact that we regard that as history in North America and not as present-day violence is part of the machinations that work to make us oblivious to what's happening also in Palestine, which is one example of settler colonization among many, and it's not exceptional in that regard, nor will the end of settler colonization be exceptional in Palestine. Thank you.